They walked out of Egypt with miracles in their wake. The Red Sea split, Pharaoh drowned, chains broken. God himself led them by fire and cloud. They were the chosen ones, destined for a land overflowing with abundance. Victory was written in their DNA, but then they saw the giants. Numbers is the forbidden chapter of Israel's story, the one where God's people looked at his promises and said no, where the earth literally opened up and devoured those who dared challenge divine authority, where a snake on a pole held the power of life and death, where a donkey saw angels that a prophet couldn't see. This isn't religion. This is raw, terrifying, supernatural reality. 600,000 soldiers strong, yet they trembled like children. 40 years of circling the same mountains, burying their dreams one corpse at a time. Moses himself, the man who spoke with God face to face, made one mistake and watched the promised land from a distance he could never cross. But here's the prophecy embedded in these pages. Their failure wasn't the end of the story. It was a warning across time. Every rebellion recorded, every judgment documented, every death a message to you. Are you standing at your own edge of promise, about to turn back? The wilderness of Sinai stretched endlessly in every direction. Israel had been camped at the base of the mountain for nearly a year when God spoke to Moses with a new command. On the first day of the second month in the second year after leaving Egypt, as recorded in chapter 1 verse 1, the Lord called Moses into the tent of meeting. The message was direct: count the people. But this wasn't just any head count. God wanted every male 20 years old and above, everyone who could serve in the army. Moses wasn't doing this alone. Each tribe would send one man, a leader from his own family line, to help with the census. Chapter 1 verses 5 through 16 list their names carefully. From Reuben came Elizur, son of Shadur. From Simeon came Shelumiel, son of Zurishaddai. From Judah came Nahshon, son of Amminadab. The list continued through all 12 tribes. Moses and Aaron, along with these 12 leaders, began the work that very day. They gathered the whole community together and recorded each person's ancestry, clan by clan, family by family. One by one, men registered their names. From Reuben's tribe came 46,500 fighting men. From Simeon, 59,300. Judah brought the largest count, 74,600 warriors ready for battle. The numbers kept climbing. Issachar contributed 54,400. Zebulun added 57,400. Joseph's descendants split into two tribes, Ephraim with 4,500 and Manasseh with 32,200. Benjamin counted 35,400. Dan brought 62,700. Asher added 41,500. Gad contributed 45,650. Naphtali counted 53,400 fighting men. When the census was complete, as chapter 1 verse 46 records, the total was staggering: 603,550 warriors. Over 600,000 men ready to fight, not counting women, children, or the elderly. Israel wasn't just a refugee group anymore. But there was one tribe missing from this count: the Levites. God specifically told Moses in chapter 1 verses 47 through 49 not to include them in this census. They had a different calling, a sacred duty that had nothing to do with warfare. Chapter 2 reveals God's next instruction: organization. Every tribe received specific camping positions around the tabernacle. On the east side, facing the sunrise, Judah would camp with Issachar and Zebulun, 189 to 300 men strong. South of the tabernacle, Reuben would pitch tents alongside Simeon and Gad, totaling 151,150 warriors. The west belonged to Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, 108 to 100 men. And on the north side, Dan would camp with Asher and Naphtali, bringing 157,600 fighters. At the center of everything sat the tent of meeting, surrounded by the Levites. They formed a protective ring around God's dwelling place. As chapter 2 verse 17 states, when the camp moved, the tent of meeting would travel in the middle of the tribes. The camp wasn't random, it was a blueprint. The tabernacle at the center reminded everyone that God lived among them. While the other tribes prepared for war, the Levites received a completely different mission. Chapter 3 opens with a genealogy, the family line of Aaron and Moses. Aaron had 4 sons, Nadab the firstborn, then Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These were the anointed priests ordained to serve God directly. But tragedy had already struck this family. Nadab and Abihu died before the Lord when they offered unauthorized fire in his presence, as mentioned in chapter 3, verse 4. They had no sons, so Eleazar and Ithamar served as priests under their father Aaron's supervision. Then God spoke to Moses with instructions about the entire tribe of Levi. Chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 record the command, "Bring the tribe of Levi forward and present them to Aaron the priest to assist him." The Levites would perform duties for Aaron and the whole community at the tent of meeting by doing the work of the tabernacle. Their job description was clear in verses 7 and 8. They would take care of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting and fulfill obligations for the Israelites. And according to verse 9, they were given entirely to Aaron and his sons from among all the Israelites. But why the Levites specifically? God explained in chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. When he struck down every firstborn in Egypt, he spared Israel's firstborn sons. Those firstborn became his. But now God was making an exchange. He would take the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the Israelites. Moses conducted another census, this one counting every male Levite from 1 month old and up. Chapter 3, verse 15 gives the instruction clearly. The Levites descended from 3 of Levi's sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Each clan received specific camping positions around the tabernacle. The Gershonites camped on the west side. Chapter 3, verse 25 explains their responsibility. They cared for the tabernacle itself, the tent, its covering, the curtain at the entrance, the courtyard curtains, and everything related to their use. The Kohathites camped on the south side of the tabernacle. Their duty, outlined in verse 31, was the most sacred. They were responsible for the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altars, the articles of the sanctuary used in ministering, the curtain, and everything related to their use. The Merarites set up camp on the north side. Verse 36 lists their assignment: the frames of the tabernacle, its crossbars, posts, bases, all its equipment, plus the posts of the surrounding courtyard with their bases, tent pegs, and ropes. But directly in front of the tabernacle, on the east side toward the sunrise, Moses and Aaron and his sons camped. Chapter 3, verse 38 makes clear they were responsible for the sanctuary on behalf of the Israelites. Anyone else who approached the sanctuary would be put to death. The total count of Levite males from a month old and up came to 22,000, as recorded in verse 39. Meanwhile, God instructed Moses to count all the firstborn Israelite males from a month old and up. That number reached 22,273, according to verse 43. There were 273 more firstborn Israelites than Levites, so God established a redemption price in verses 46 through 48, 5 shekels per person. Moses collected the redemption money from those who exceeded the number of Levites, 1,365 shekels total, and gave it to Aaron and his sons, just as the Lord commanded. The general assignments were clear, but God wasn't done organizing. Chapter 4 opens with more specific instructions. This time, God told Moses and Aaron to take a census of the Kohathite branch of the Levites by their clans and families. But there was a condition in verse 3. Count all the men from 30 to 50 years old who come to serve in the work at the tent of meeting. The Kohathites had the most dangerous job, as verse 4 explains. They would care for the most holy things in the tent of meeting, but they couldn't just walk in and start carrying sacred objects. Chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 describe the careful process. When the camp prepared to move, Aaron and his sons would go in first and take down the shielding curtain to cover the Ark of the Covenant law. Then they'd cover it with durable leather, spread a blue cloth over that, and insert the carrying poles. The table of the presence required similar treatment. They'd spread a blue cloth over it, place the plates, dishes, bowls, and pitchers for drink offerings on top, along with the bread that was continually there. Then they'd cover everything with scarlet cloth, add a covering of durable leather, and insert the poles for carrying. Verses 9 and 10 detailed the procedure for the lampstand. Wrap it in blue cloth, along with its lamps, wick trimmers, trays, and olive oil jars. Then bundle everything in durable leather and put it on a carrying frame. The critical rule appears in verses 15 and 16. After Aaron and his sons finished covering the holy furnishings and all the sacred articles, and when the camp was ready to move, only then could the Kohathites come to carry them. But they must not touch the holy things, or they would die. God's warning to Moses and Aaron in verses 17 through 20 was severe. They needed to make sure the Kohathite tribal clans were not destroyed from among the Levites. To keep them alive when they approached the most holy things, Aaron and his sons must go in and assign each man to his specific task. The Kohathites must not go in to look at the holy things, even for a moment, or they would die. The Gershonites also received detailed assignments. Chapter 4, verses 24 through 26 explain their service, carry the curtains of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting itself, its covering, the outer covering of durable leather, the courtyard curtains, and all the equipment used in service. The Merarites received their assignments in verses 31 and 32. Carry the frames of the tabernacle, its crossbars, posts, and bases, the posts of the surrounding courtyard with their bases, tent pegs, ropes, and all equipment related to their use. Each man would be assigned specific items to carry by name. Moses, Aaron, and the community leaders counted the Kohathites, all the men from 30 to 50 years old. The number came to 2,050, as verse 36 records. The Gershonites totaled 2,630, according to verse 40. The Merarites numbered 3,200, as stated in verse 44. The grand total came to 8,580 men. As chapter 4, verse 48 confirms, the camp was organized. The workers were counted and assigned. But God had standards for this community. Chapter 5 begins with instructions about purity. Verses 1 and 2 record God telling Moses to command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone with a skin disease, anyone with a bodily discharge, and anyone ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. Verse 3 explains the reason. They must send them outside the camp so they wouldn't defile the camp where God dwelt among them. The Israelites did exactly as the Lord instructed Moses, according to verse 4, but physical purity wasn't enough. Chapter 5, verses 5 and 6 introduce laws about wrongdoing. When a man or woman wrongs another in any way and is unfaithful to the Lord, that person becomes guilty. The remedy appears in verse 7. Confess the sin committed, make full restitution, add a fifth of the value to it, and give it all to the person wronged. If that person had no close relative to whom restitution could be made, it belonged to the Lord and went to the priest. Then God addressed one of the most difficult situations in any community: suspected adultery without evidence. Chapter 5, verse 12 sets up the situation. Suppose a man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him by sleeping with another man, and this is hidden from her husband with no witness against her. Verse 14 continues, if feelings of jealousy come over the husband and he suspects his wife, what happens next? The procedure is detailed in verses 15 through 18. The husband must take his wife to the priest, along with a required offering of 1/10 of an ephah of barley flour. The priest would bring her forward and have her stand before the Lord. Then he'd take holy water in a clay jar and put dust from the tabernacle floor into the water. The oath comes in verses 19 through 22. The priest would put the woman under oath, saying, If no other man has had sexual relations with you, may this bitter water not harm you. But if you have gone astray while married to your husband, then the priest would put the woman under this curse. May the Lord cause you to become a curse among your people when he makes your womb miscarry and your abdomen swell. The woman had to respond, Amen, so be it. As verse 22 states, verses 23 through 26 describe what happened next. The priest would write these curses on a scroll and wash them off into the bitter water. He'd make the woman drink the bitter water, take the grain offering from her hands, wave it before the Lord, and bring it to the altar. The results were supernatural. Verse 27 explains, if she had defiled herself and been unfaithful, the water would cause bitter suffering. Her abdomen would swell, her womb would miscarry, and she would become a curse. But verse 28 provides the alternative. If she hadn't defiled herself and was clean, she would be cleared of guilt and able to have children. From issues of impurity and unfaithfulness, God moved to voluntary dedication. Chapter 6 opens with the Lord speaking to Moses about the Nazirite vow. Verse 2 introduces the concept. When a man or woman wanted to make a special vow, a vow of dedication to the Lord as a Nazirite, they could choose this path. The requirements were specific. Verses 3 and 4 explain the first restriction. They must abstain from wine and other fermented drink. They couldn't drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. As long as they remained a Nazirite, they must not eat anything from the grapevine. The second restriction appears in verse 5. During the entire period of their dedication, no razor could be used on their head. They must be holy until the period of dedication to the Lord was over. They had to let their hair grow long. The third restriction comes in verses 6 and 7. Throughout the period of dedication to the Lord, the Nazirite must not go near a dead body. Even if their own father or mother died, they must not make themselves ceremonially unclean. But what if someone died suddenly in the Nazirite's presence? Verses 9 through 12 provide the solution. They must shave their head on the 7th day. On the 8th day, they'd bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest. The priest would offer one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. That same day, they'd consecrate their head again and rededicate themselves to the Lord. The previous days wouldn't count. The completion ceremony was elaborate. Chapter 6, verses 13 through 20 lay out the procedure. When the period of dedication was over, the Nazirite had to be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting with multiple offerings. Then the Nazirite would shave off the hair dedicated to God and put it in the fire under the fellowship offering. After this, the Nazirite could drink wine. After laws about purity, jealousy, and dedication, God gave Israel something beautiful. Chapter 6, verse 22 records the Lord speaking to Moses with instructions for Aaron and his sons. Verse 23 states the command directly. This is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the blessing itself appears in verses 24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. 3 lines. 3 mentions of God's name, each line building on the previous one. The first asked for blessing and protection, God's favor and God's guard over his people. The second requested God's favor and grace, his face shining like the sun on those he loved, bringing warmth and light to their lives. The third sought God's attention and peace, his face turned toward them, his eyes watching them with care, his shalom covering every aspect of their existence. This wasn't a casual prayer. This was God's own formula for blessing, given directly from heaven. The priest didn't make up these words. They didn't adjust them based on circumstances or feelings. They spoke exactly what God commanded them to speak. Verse 27 explains the purpose with profound simplicity. So they will put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them. When the priest spoke these words over the people, they were placing God's own name on them. It was God's personal stamp, his identification mark on his people. Like a seal pressed into wax, this blessing marked Israel as belonging to the Lord, and with his name came his blessing. The words weren't magical formulas. They were relational declarations. God was claiming his people and promising to care for them. Every time the priests pronounced this blessing, they reminded Israel whose they were. The tabernacle stood complete. Chapter 7, verse 1 sets the timeline. When Moses finished setting up the tabernacle, he anointed and consecrated it and all its furnishings. The leaders of Israel came forward with offerings, as verse 2 states. Verse 3 describes what they brought: 6 covered carts and 12 oxen. God told Moses in verses 4 and 5 to accept the gifts and use them in the work at the tent of meeting. Moses distributed them to the Levites. He gave 2 carts and 4 oxen to the Gershonites, and 4 carts and 8 oxen to the Merarites. But Moses didn't give any to the Kohathites. Verse 9 explains why. They were to carry the holy things on their shoulders. Then came 12 days of dedication offerings. The Lord told Moses in verse 11 that each day one leader should bring his offering. The first day belonged to Nahshon, son of Amminadab of Judah. Verses 13 through 17 detail his offering: silver plates, gold dishes, animals for burnt offerings, sin offerings, and fellowship offerings. Each of the 12 tribal leaders brought the exact same offering on their assigned day. The text carefully records each leader's name and their identical gifts. Verse 89 adds one crucial detail. When Moses entered the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from between the 2 cherubim above the atonement cover on the ark. The tabernacle wasn't just a building. It was a meeting place. Chapter 8 continues with instructions about the lampstand. Aaron set up the lamps so they faced forward, just as the Lord commanded Moses. Then came the formal consecration of the Levites. God told Moses in verses 5 and 6 to take the Levites from among all the Israelites and make them ceremonially clean. The purification process included sprinkling water, shaving their bodies, and washing their clothes. The whole community participated in setting apart the Levites. After this ceremony, the Levites came to do their work at the tent of meeting, as verse 22 records. Verses 23 through 26 establish the age requirements. Men 25 years old or more should come to take part in the work, but at age 50, they must retire from regular service. Finally, chapter 9 addresses the Passover. Verse 1 sets the time. The Lord spoke to Moses in the desert of Sinai in the first month of the 2nd year. Verse 2 contains the command: have the Israelites celebrate the Passover at the appointed time. Moses told the Israelites to celebrate the Passover, and they did exactly that, according to verses 4 and 5. But some men were ceremonially unclean and couldn't celebrate. They came to Moses and asked in verse 7 why they should be kept from presenting the Lord's offering. Moses answered in verse 8, wait until I find out what the Lord commands concerning you. God's response came in verses 9 through 14. Those unclean or away on a journey could celebrate the Passover on the 14th day of the 2nd month instead. However, anyone ceremonially clean who failed to celebrate must be cut off from their people. The final section of chapter 9 introduces the cloud. Verse 15 describes what happened on the day the tabernacle was set up. The cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud looked like fire. Verses 17 and 18 explain the system. Whenever the cloud lifted, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, they encamped. At the Lord's command, they moved. Sometimes the cloud stayed a long time, sometimes only a few days. Whether it stayed for a day, a month, or a year, the Israelites remained in camp until it lifted. At the Lord's command they encamped, and at his command they set out. As verse 23 concludes, everything was ready. The camp was organized, the workers assigned, the laws established. But God had one more instruction before Israel began their journey. Chapter 10 verse 1 records the Lord telling Moses to make 2 trumpets of hammered silver. These weren't decorative items. They were communication tools. Verse 2 explains their purpose. Use them for calling the community together and for having the camps set out. Different trumpet sounds would signal different messages. When both trumpets sounded a long blast, the whole community would assemble at the entrance to the tent of meeting, as verse 3 states. But if only one trumpet sounded, just the leaders would gather, according to verse 4. Verses 5 and 6 detail the marching signals. When a trumpet blast sounded, the tribes camping on the east would set out. At the second blast, the camps on the south would start moving. The sons of Aaron, the priests, were to blow the trumpets, as verse 8 states. This was to be a lasting ordinance for generations to come. Then came the moment. On the 20th day of the second month of the second year, the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle of the covenant law, as chapter 10 verse 11 records. The Israelites set out from the desert of Sinai and traveled from place to place until the cloud came to rest in the desert of Paran. According to verse 12, the divisions of Judah went first under their standard. Then the tabernacle was taken down, and the Gershonites and Merarites who carried it set out. Next came Reuben's divisions. Then the Kohathites set out, carrying the holy things. The tabernacle would be set up before they arrived. The divisions of Ephraim went next. Finally, as the rear guard for all the units, the divisions of Dan set out. This was the order of march for the Israelite divisions as they set out. Moses said to Hobab, son of Ruel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, in verse 29, "We are setting out for the place about which the Lord said, 'I will give it to you. Come with us and we will treat you well.' But Hobab answered in verse 30, 'No, I will not go. I'm going back to my own land and my own people.' Moses persisted in verse 31, 'Please do not leave us. You know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you can be our eyes.' Whenever the ark set out, Moses would say what's recorded in verse 35, 'Rise up, Lord. May your enemies be scattered. May your foes flee before you.' They were barely 3 days into the journey when everything changed. Chapter 11, verse 1 states it plainly. Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. Their complaints weren't specific. They just expressed dissatisfaction. God's response was immediate and severe. His anger was aroused, and fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. This wasn't a natural fire. This was divine judgment falling on complainers. When the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down, according to verse 2. The place was named Taberah, which means burning, because fire from the Lord had burned among them. As verse 3 records, but the lesson didn't stick. The trouble started with a specific group. Chapter 11, verse 4 identifies them as the rabble, foreigners who had joined Israel when they left Egypt. They began to crave other food, and soon the Israelites started weeping again, saying, "If only we had meat to eat." Their complaints grew more detailed in verse 5. "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic." Verse 6 captures their disgust with God's provision. "But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each at the entrance to their tent. The Lord became very angry, and Moses was troubled, as verse 10 states. He asked the Lord in verse 11, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant?" His frustration poured out in verses 12 through 15. He said, "Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.' I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me." God's response came in verses 16 and 17. He told Moses to bring 70 of Israel's elders to the tent of meeting. God would take some of the power of the Spirit that was on Moses and put it on them. They would share the burden of the people. Then God addressed the meat issue. He told Moses in verses 18 and 19 to tell the people they would eat meat, not for just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5, 10, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it came out of their nostrils and they loathed it, because they had rejected the Lord. Moses questioned this in verse 21. "Here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say, 'I will give them meat to eat for a whole month.' The Lord answered Moses in verse 23, "Is the Lord's arm too short? Now you will see whether or not what I say will come true for you." Moses gathered the 70 elders around the tent. The Lord came down in the cloud and spoke with him. He took some of the power of the Spirit that was on Moses and put it on the 70 elders. When the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, as verse 25 records. 2 men, Eldad and Medad, had remained in the camp. Yet the Spirit rested on them too, and they prophesied in the camp, as verse 26 records. Joshua spoke up in verse 28, "Moses, my Lord, stop them!" But Moses replied in verse 29, "Are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets." Then the meat came. A wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. It brought them down all around the camp to about 3 feet above the ground, as far as a day's walk in any direction. According to verse 31, all that day and night and all the next day, the people went out and gathered quail. No one gathered less than 10 homers, as verse 32 states, but while the meat was still between their teeth, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague, as verse 33 records. The place was named Kibroth Hattava, which means graves of craving, because there they buried the people who had craved other food. At Hazeroth, a new problem emerged from within Moses' own family. Chapter 12, verse 1 states that Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife. Their real grievance came out in verse 2. "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us?" They were challenging Moses' unique authority, and the Lord heard this. Verse 3 adds a crucial detail. Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. He didn't defend himself, but God didn't stay silent. At once, the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam in verse 4, "Come out to the tent of meeting, all 3 of you." Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance to the tent. He summoned Aaron and Miriam, as verse 5 states. His words in verses 6 through 8 establish the hierarchy clearly. "Listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I make myself known to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" The anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left them, as verse 9 records. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam's skin was leprous. It became as white as snow. Aaron turned toward her and saw that she had a defiling skin disease. Aaron said to Moses in verses 11 and 12, "Please, my Lord, I ask you not to hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed." So Moses cried out to the Lord in verse 13, "Please, God, heal her." The Lord replied to Moses in verse 14, "If her father had spit in her face, would she not have been in disgrace for 7 days? Confine her outside the camp for 7 days. After that, she can be brought back." So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on till she was brought back. As verse 15 states, they were now in the desert of Paran, at the edge of the promised land. Chapter 13, verse 1 records the Lord saying to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. Verses 4 through 15 list their names, including Caleb son of Jephunneh from Judah and Hoshea son of Nun from Ephraim. Moses gave Hoshea the name Joshua, as verse 16 notes, when Moses sent them to explore Canaan. He said in verse 17, "Go up through the Negev and on into the hill country." He gave them specific instructions in verses 18 through 20. "See what the land is like and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? How is the soil? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land." So they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, They cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. As verse 23 states, at the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. According to verse 25, they came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There, they reported to them and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account in verse 27. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. The positive report ended quickly. Verse 28 continues, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said in verse 30, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the other men said in verse 31, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. They spread a bad report, as verse 32 states. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. Chapter 14, verse 1 records that all the people raised their voices and wept aloud. That night all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole assembly said to them in verse 2, if only we had died in Egypt. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land, only to let us fall by the sword? And they said to each other in verse 4, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole assembly. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes and said to the entire assembly in verses 7 through 9, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent. The Lord said to Moses in verse 11, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them. Moses pleaded for the people in verses 13 through 19. He reminded God that the nations had heard about his power. If he destroyed Israel now, they would say the Lord wasn't able to bring them into the land. The Lord replied in verse 20, I have forgiven them, as you asked. But then came the judgment in verses 21 through 23. Nevertheless, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised. Verse 24 makes an exception. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to. God continued in verses 26 through 35. In this wilderness their bodies would fall, everyone 20 years old or more who had grumbled against him. Not one would enter the land except Caleb and Joshua. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days, the spies explored the land. They would wander until the last of their bodies lay in the wilderness. The men who spread the bad report were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord, as verse 37 records. Only Joshua and Caleb survived. When Moses reported this to all the Israelites, they mourned bitterly. Early the next morning they set out for the highest point in the hill country, saying in verse 40, now we are ready to go up to the land the Lord promised. But Moses said in verses 41 through 43, why are you disobeying the Lord's command? This will not succeed. Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. Nevertheless, they went up toward the highest point, though neither Moses nor the ark moved from the camp. Then the Amalekites and Canaanites came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah, according to verse 45. After the devastating judgment, God gave Israel laws for the future. Chapter 15, verse 1 records the Lord saying to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, after you enter the land I am giving you as a home. The laws that followed were for when they eventually entered Canaan. Verses 2 through 16 detail offerings that would accompany sacrifices in the land. Verses 17 through 21 address the first fruits of their ground meal. Then verses 22 through 31 distinguish between unintentional and intentional sins. If the whole community sinned unintentionally, they could make atonement with specific offerings. But anyone who sinned defiantly blasphemed the Lord and must be cut off from the people, as verse 30 states. Then came a test case. While the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day, as verse 32 records. Those who found him brought him to Moses and Aaron and kept him in custody because it wasn't clear what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses in verse 35, "The man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp." So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death. As the Lord commanded Moses according to verse 36, the chapter ends with instructions about tassels. The Lord said to Moses in verses 37 and 38 to tell the Israelites to make tassels on the corners of their garments with a blue cord on each tassel. Verse 39 explains, "You will have these tassels to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of the Lord." The grumbling wasn't over. Chapter 16, verse 1, introduces a new rebellion. Korah, son of Izhar, along with Dathan and Abiram and On, son of Peleth, became insolent and rose up against Moses. With them were 250 Israelite men, well-known community leaders. They came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said to them in verse 3, "You have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" When Moses heard this, he fell face down. Then he said to Korah and all his followers in verses 5 through 7 that in the morning the Lord would show who belongs to him and who is holy. They were to take censers and put incense in them before the Lord. The man the Lord chose would be the one who is holy. Moses also said to Korah in verses 8 through 11, "Isn't it enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the community and brought you near himself to do the work at the Lord's tabernacle? Now you are trying to get the priesthood too. It is against the Lord that you and all your followers have banded together." Then Moses summoned Dathan and Abiram, but they refused to come, saying in verses 12 through 14, "We will not come. Isn't it enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness?" Moses became very angry. The next day, each man took his censer and stood at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Korah gathered all his followers, the glory of the Lord appeared to the entire assembly. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in verse 20, "Separate yourselves from this assembly so I can put an end to them at once." But Moses and Aaron fell face down and cried out in verse 22, "O God, will you be angry with the entire assembly when only one man sins?" Moses warned the assembly in verse 26, "Move back from the tents of these wicked men. Do not touch anything belonging to them, or you will be swept away." Then Moses said in verses 28 through 30, "This is how you will know that the Lord has sent me. If these men die a natural death, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about something totally new, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt." As soon as he finished saying this, the ground under them split apart. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their households. They went down alive into the realm of the dead. The earth closed over them, and they perished. According to verses 32 and 33, "And fire came out from the Lord, and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense." As verse 35 states, the censers were hammered into sheets to overlay the altar as a reminder that no one except a descendant of Aaron should come to burn incense before the Lord. The very next day, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying in verse 41, "You have killed the Lord's people." When the assembly gathered, the glory of the Lord appeared. The Lord said to Moses in verse 45, "Get away from this assembly so I can put an end to them at..." Once Moses said to Aaron in verse 46, "Take your censer and put incense in it, along with burning coals from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them." The plague has started. Aaron ran into the midst of the assembly. He stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people died from the plague, in addition to those who had died because of Korah. According to verse 49, to settle the question permanently, the Lord said to Moses in chapter 17, verse 2, to get 12 staffs from the Israelites, one from each tribal leader. The staff belonging to the man God chose would sprout. The next day Moses entered the tent and saw that Aaron's staff had not only sprouted, but had budded, blossomed and produced almonds, as verse 8 states. The Lord said to Moses in verse 10, "Put back Aaron's staff in front of the ark of the covenant law, to be kept as a sign to the rebellious." Chapter 18 then establishes the duties and privileges of priests and Levites. The Lord said to Aaron in verse 1 that he and his family would bear the responsibility for offenses connected with the sanctuary. God explained that the priests would receive portions of the offerings as their provision. The Lord said to Moses in verse 21, "I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work they do while serving." At the tent of meeting, the years of wandering stretched ahead. Death would be a constant companion in the wilderness, and God knew his people would need a way to deal with the ritual uncleanness that came from contact with corpses. Chapter 19, verse 1, records the Lord saying to Moses and Aaron with a new regulation that seemed strange, but served a critical purpose. Verse 2 contains the command, "This is a requirement of the law that the Lord has commanded. Tell the Israelites to bring you a red heifer without defect or blemish, and that has never been under a yoke. They were to give it to Eleazar the priest, and it was to be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence, as verse 3 states. Then Eleazar was to take some of its blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. According to verse 4, while he watched, the heifer was to be burned, its hide, flesh, blood, and intestines, as verse 5 records. The priest was to take cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool, and throw them onto the burning heifer, according to verse 6. After that, the priest had to wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. He could then come into the camp, but he would be ceremonially unclean till evening, as verse 7 states. The man who burned the heifer also had to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he too would be unclean till evening. According to verse 8, a man who was clean would then gather up the ashes of the heifer and put them in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp. They were to be kept by the Israelite community for use in the water of cleansing. It was for purification from sin, as verse 9 explains. The man who gathered the ashes also had to wash his clothes, and he would be unclean till evening. This was to be a lasting ordinance both for the Israelites and for the foreigners residing among them. According to verse 10, verses 11 through 13 establish the basic principle: whoever touched a human corpse would be unclean for 7 days. They had to purify themselves with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and then they would be clean. But if they did not purify themselves on the 3rd and 7th days, they would not be clean. If they failed to purify themselves after touching a dead body, they defiled the Lord's tabernacle. They had to be cut off from Israel because the water of cleansing had not been sprinkled on them, and their uncleanness remained on them. The law applied to various situations. Verse 14 states, "This is the law that applies when a person dies in a tent. Anyone who enters the tent and anyone who is in it will be unclean for 7 days. Any open container without a lid fastened on it was unclean." As verse 15 adds, "Anyone out in the open who touched someone who had been killed with a sword, or someone who had died a natural death, or anyone who touched a human bone or a grave, would be unclean for 7 days." According to verse 16, for the unclean person, they were to put some ashes from the burned purification offering into a jar and pour fresh water over them, as verse 17 explains. Then a man who was ceremonially clean was to take hyssop, dip it in the water, and sprinkle the tent and all the furnishings and the people who were there. He was also to sprinkle anyone who had touched a human bone or a grave, or anyone who had been killed, or anyone who had died a natural death. According to verse 18, the man who was clean was to sprinkle those who were unclean on the 3rd and 7th days, and on the 7th day he was to purify them. Those being cleansed had to wash their clothes and bathe with water, and that evening they would be clean. As verse 19 states, but anyone who was unclean and did not purify themselves had to be cut off from the community, because they had defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. The water of cleansing had not been sprinkled on them, and they were unclean, as verse 20 explains. This was a lasting ordinance for them. The man who sprinkled the water of cleansing also had to wash his clothes, and anyone who touched the water of cleansing would be unclean till evening. According to verse 21, anything that an unclean person touched became unclean, and anyone who touched it became unclean till evening. As verse 22 concludes, time passed in the wilderness. The first generation slowly died off one by one. Chapter 20, verse 1 records a significant loss. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. She had been with them from the beginning, the sister who watched baby Moses in the river, the prophetess who led the women in celebration after crossing the Red Sea. Now she was gone. And there was no water for the community, so the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron, as verse 2 states. They quarreled with Moses and said in verse 3, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord." The complaints continued in verses 4 and 5. "Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them, as verse 6 records. The Lord said to Moses in verse 7, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him, as verse 9 states. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock. But then something went wrong. Moses said to them in verse 10, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" The words were harsh, angry, and they put Moses and Aaron in God's place. Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff, as verse 11 records. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in verse 12, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." One moment of anger, one act of disobedience, one failure to give God the glory. And the price was everything Moses had worked toward for 40 years. These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and where he was proved holy among them. As verse 13 states, from Kadesh, Moses sent messengers to the king of Edom with a diplomatic request. Chapter 20, verse 14 records the message. "This is what your brother Israel says. You know about all the hardships that have come on us." The message continued in verses 15 and 16, recounting their time in Egypt, their cry for help, and how God had brought them out. Now they were at Kadesh, a town on the edge of Edom's territory. The request came in verse 17, "Please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory." It was a reasonable request between relatives. After all, Edom descended from Esau, Jacob's brother. But Edom answered in verse 18, "You may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with the sword." The Israelites replied in verse 19, We will go along the main road, and if we or our livestock drink any of your water, we will pay for it. We only want to pass through on foot, nothing else. But again Edom answered in verse 20, You may not pass through. Then Edom came out against them with a large and powerful army, as verse 20 continues. Since Edom refused to let them go through their territory, Israel turned away from them. As verse 21 concludes, the whole Israelite community set out from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor, as verse 22 records. At Mount Hor, near the border of Edom, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in verse 23, Aaron will be gathered to his people. He will not enter the land I give the Israelites, because both of you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. The sentence stood. No appeal, no second chance. Verse 25 contains God's instructions. Get Aaron and his son Eleazar and take them up Mount Hor. Moses was to remove Aaron's garments and put them on his son Eleazar, for Aaron would be gathered to his people and die there, as verse 26 states. Moses did as the Lord commanded. They went up Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community, as verse 27 records. Moses removed Aaron's garments and put them on his son Eleazar, and Aaron died there on top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, according to verse 28, when the whole community learned that Aaron had died. All the Israelites mourned for him 30 days, as verse 29 concludes. The high priest was gone. Moses' brother, his spokesman, his partner in leading Israel, dead at 123 years old. The old generation was passing away. As Israel continued their journey, they faced opposition. Chapter 21, verse 1 records that when the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming along the road to Atharim, he attacked the Israelites and captured some of them. This was the first military conflict in a long time. Then Israel made a vow to the Lord in verse 2. If you will deliver these people into our hands, we will totally destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's plea and gave the Canaanites over to them. They completely destroyed them and their towns, so the place was named Hormah, which means destruction, as verse 3 states. But then the people's attitude soured again. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom, but the people grew impatient on the way, as verse 4 records. They spoke against God and against Moses in verse 5. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food. They were complaining about manna again, the miraculous bread from heaven that had sustained them for decades. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died, as verse 6 states. The judgment was swift and deadly. The people came to Moses and said in verse 7, We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us. So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses in verse 8, Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived, as verse 9 records. The cure seemed strange, looking at the image of the very thing that was killing them. But it required faith. It required obedience. It required believing that God's method, however unusual, would work. And it did. The Israelites moved on and camped in various places as they traveled around Moab. Chapter 21, verse 10 begins listing their journey. They camped at Oboth, then at Abarim in the wilderness, then in the Zered valley, then beyond the Arnon. They came to Beer, which is the well where the Lord said to Moses in verse 16, Gather the people together, and I will give them water. There Israel sang this song recorded in verses 17 and 18. Spring up, O well! Sing about it, about the well that the princes dug, that the nobles of the people sank, the nobles with scepters and staffs. From the wilderness they went on to Mattanah, then to Nahaliel, to Bamoth, and to the valley in Moab, where the top of Pisgah overlooks the wasteland. As verses 18 through 20 detail, They were now approaching the kingdoms east of the Jordan River. Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, with a peaceful request recorded in verses 21 and 22. "Let us pass through your country. We will not turn aside into any field or vineyard, or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway until we have passed through your territory." It was the same request they'd made to Edom. But Sihon would not let Israel pass through his territory. He mustered his entire army and marched out into the wilderness against Israel. When he reached Jahaz, he fought with Israel, as verse 23 states. This time, the outcome was different. Israel put him to the sword and took over his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, but only as far as the Ammonites, because their border was fortified. According to verse 24, Israel captured all the cities of the Amorites and occupied them, including Heshbon and all its surrounding settlements. As verse 25 records, Heshbon was the city of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and had taken from him all his land as far as the Arnon, as verse 26 explains. The text includes a song in verses 27 through 30 about Sihon's previous conquests, which now belonged to Israel. Then they turned and went up along the road toward Bashan. And Og, king of Bashan, and his whole army marched out to meet them in battle at Edrei, as verse 33 records. The Lord said to Moses in verse 34, "Do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands, along with his whole army and his land. Do to him what you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon." So they struck him down, together with his sons and his whole army, leaving them no survivors. And they took possession of his land, as verse 35 concludes. 2 kingdoms defeated, 2 territories conquered. Israel was no longer wandering aimlessly. They were taking ground. Then the Israelites traveled to the plains of Moab and camped along the Jordan, across from Jericho, as chapter 22, verse 1 records. They were right at the edge of the Promised Land, visible to everyone in the region. And it terrified the surrounding nations. Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites, as verses 2 and 3 state. The Moabites said to the elders of Midian in verse 4, "This horde is going to lick up everything around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field." So Balak sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Petha, near the Euphrates River, in his native land. The message in verses 5 and 6 read, "A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people, because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps then I will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." Balak was trying to use spiritual weapons against Israel, since military power had failed. The elders of Moab and Midian left, taking with them the fee for divination. When they came to Balaam, they told him what Balak had said, as verse 7 records. Balaam said to them in verse 8, "Spend the night here, and I will report back to you with the answer the Lord gives me." So the Moabite officials stayed with him. God came to Balaam and asked in verse 9, "Who are these men with you?" Balaam said to God in verse 10, "Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, sent me this message. A people that has come out of Egypt covers the face of the land. Now come and put a curse on them for me. Perhaps then I will be able to fight them and drive them away." But God said to Balaam in verse 12, "Do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people, because they are blessed." The next morning, Balaam got up and said to Balak's officials in verse 13, "Go back to your own country, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you." So the Moabite officials returned to Balak and said in verse 14, "Balaam refused to come with us." Then Balak sent other officials, more numerous and more distinguished than the first, as verse 15 records. They came to Balaam and said in verses 16 and 17, "This is what Balak son of Zippor says. Do not let anything keep you from coming to me, because I will reward you handsomely and do whatever you say. Come and put a curse on these people for me." The offer was tempting: money, honor, influence. But Balaam answered them in verse 18, "Even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God. Still," he added in verse 19, "now spend the night here so that I can find out what else the Lord will tell me." He already had God's answer, but he asked again, hoping for a different response. That night, God came to Balaam and said in verse 20, "Since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you." So Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the Moabite officials, as verse 21 records. But God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him, as verse 22 states. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, it turned off the road into a field. Balaam beat it to get it back on the road, as verse 23 records. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path through the vineyards, with walls on both sides. When the donkey saw the angel, it pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. So he beat the donkey again, according to verses 24 and 25. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn, either to the right or to the left, as verse 26 states. When the donkey saw the angel, it lay down under Balaam, and he was angry and beat it with his staff. According to verse 27, then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and it said to Balaam in verse 28, "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam answered the donkey in verse 29, "You have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." The donkey said to Balaam in verse 30, "Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" And Balaam said, "No." Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down, as verse 31 records. The angel of the Lord asked him in verse 32, "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you, because your path is a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared it." Balaam said to the angel of the Lord in verse 34, "I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now if you are displeased, I will go back." The angel of the Lord told Balaam in verse 35, "Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you." So Balaam went with Balak's officials. When Balak heard that Balaam was coming, he went out to meet him. Balak said to Balaam in verse 37, "Did I not send you an urgent summons? Why didn't you come to me? Am I really not able to reward you?" Balaam replied in verse 38, "Well, I have come to you now, but I can't say whatever I please. I must speak only what God puts in my mouth." The next morning, Balak took Balaam up to Bamoth Baal, and from there he could see the outskirts of the Israelite camp, as verse 41 records. What followed in chapters 23 and 24 were 4 attempts by Balak to get Balaam to curse Israel, and 4 times Balaam blessed them instead. Chapter 23 records the first 2 attempts. Each time Balaam had Balak build altars and offer sacrifices. Each time Balaam went off to meet with God, and each time, instead of curses, blessings came out of his mouth. In his first oracle, in verses 7 through 10, Balaam said, "How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced?" He described Israel as a people living apart and not considering themselves one of the nations, ending with, "Let me die the death of the righteous, and may my final end be like theirs." Balak was furious, but Balaam reminded him in verse 12, "Must I not speak what the Lord puts in my mouth?" They tried again from a different location. The second oracle in verses 18 through 24 was even stronger. Balaam declared, "God is not human, that he should lie, not a human being that he should change his mind. He proclaimed in verse 21, "The Lord their God is with them. The shout of the king is among them." And in verse 23, "No divination against Jacob, no evil omens against Israel." Chapter 24 records the third and fourth oracles. By the third attempt, Balaam didn't even go through the ritual of seeking omens. The Spirit of God came on him, and he saw Israel's camp spread out tribe by tribe, as verses 1 and 2 state. His oracle in verses 3 through 9 described Israel's future glory, ending with, "May those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed." Balak's anger burned against Balaam. He struck his hands together and said in verse 10, "I summoned you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them these 3 times." He told Balaam to leave immediately. But Balaam delivered one final oracle in verses 15 through 24, prophesying about Israel's future and the fate of surrounding nations. He saw a star coming out of Jacob and a scepter rising out of Israel. The prophecy looked far into the future, beyond the immediate circumstances. Then Balaam got up and returned home, and Balak went his own way, as verse 25 concludes. Israel remained blessed. No curse could touch them. God had spoken. While Israel was staying in Shittim, unable to be cursed spiritually, they faced a different kind of attack. Chapter 25, verse 1 records that the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women. These women invited them to the sacrifices to their gods, and the people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods, as verse 2 states. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. According to verse 3, the Lord said to Moses in verse 4, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's judges in verse 5, "Each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor." Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting, as verse 6 records. The audacity was stunning, public defiance, while the community mourned their sin. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, as verses 7 and 8 state. But those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. According to verse 9, the Lord said to Moses in verse 10, "Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites. Since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am, I did not put an end to them in my zeal." Verses 12 and 13 record God's reward. "Therefore tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites." The name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite family. And the name of the Midianite woman who was put to death was Cosbi, daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of a Midianite family, as verses 14 and 15 identify them. The Lord said to Moses in verse 16, "Treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them." They had treated Israel as enemies when they deceived them in the Peor incident. As verse 18 explains, after the plague, the Lord said to Moses and Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, in chapter 26, verse 1, "Take a census of the whole Israelite community by families, all those 20 years old or more who are able to serve in the army of Israel." This was the second census, 40 years after the first one at Mount Sinai. So on the plains of Moab, by the Jordan, across from Jericho, Moses and Eleazar the priest spoke with them and said in verse 2, "Take a census of the men 20 years old or more, as the Lord commanded Moses." The text then lists all the tribes and their numbers, matching the format of the first census, but with different totals. When the counting was done, verse 51 records the total number of the men of Israel was 601,730. The number was slightly less than the first census, 603,5050, showing that the generation had indeed died off in the wilderness. Just as God had said, the Lord said to Moses in verse 52, "The land is to be allotted to them as an inheritance based on the number of names." Verses 53 through 56 explain the distribution method. Larger groups would receive larger inheritances and smaller groups smaller ones. Each would receive its inheritance according to the number listed. But the land was to be distributed by lot, with what they inherited based on the names of their ancestral tribes. The Levites were counted separately, as always. The total number of male Levites a month old or more was 23,000, as verse 62 states. They were not counted along with the other Israelites because they received no inheritance among them. Then comes one of the most sobering verses in Scripture. Chapter 26, verse 64 states, "Not one of them was among those counted by Moses and Aaron the priest when they counted the Israelites in the desert of Sinai." Verse 65 explains why. "For the Lord had told those Israelites they would surely die in the wilderness, and not one of them was left except Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun." The judgment was complete, the sentence fully executed. Only 2 men from that original generation remained alive. Then came an important legal case. The daughters of Zelophehad approached Moses. Chapter 27, verses 1 and 2 identify them: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, daughters of Zelophehad, son of Hepher. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders and the whole assembly at the entrance to the tent of meeting. They said in verses 3 and 4, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among Korah's followers, who banded together against the Lord, but he died for his own sin and left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives." It was a reasonable request, but it challenged the existing inheritance system. So Moses brought their case before the Lord, as verse 5 records. The Lord said to him in verses 6 and 7, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives, and give their father's inheritance to them." Then God established a new law in verses 8 through 11. If a man died and left no son, his inheritance would go to his daughter. If he had no daughter, it would go to his brothers. If he had no brothers, it would go to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, it would go to the nearest relative in his clan. This was to have the force of law for the Israelites, as the Lord commanded Moses. According to verse 11, "Then the Lord said to Moses in verse 12, 'Go up this mountain in the Abarim range and see the land I have given the Israelites.' After Moses had seen it, he would be gathered to his people, as Aaron his brother was gathered, as verse 13 states. This was because both of them rebelled against God's command in the desert of Zin, when the community quarreled at the waters of Meribah. They did not honor God as holy before the Israelites, as verse 14 explains. Moses' response showed his heart. He said to the Lord in verse 15, "May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, so the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd." Moses wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the people. So the Lord said to Moses in verse 18, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him." Moses was to have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly and commission him in their presence, as verse 19 states. He was to give him some of his authority, so the whole Israelite community would obey him. According to verse 20, Joshua would stand before Eleazar the priest. who would obtain decisions for him by inquiring of the Urim before the Lord. As verse 21 explains, Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and had him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole assembly. Then he laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord instructed through Moses, according to verses 22 and 23. The transition had begun. The new generation had their leader. The promised land was within reach. Before Israel entered the promised land, God established a complete calendar of worship. These weren't suggestions. They were commands that would shape the rhythm of their lives in Canaan. Chapter 28, verse 1, records the Lord saying to Moses, "Give this command to the Israelites and say to them, make sure that you present to me at the appointed time my food offerings, as an aroma pleasing to me." Verse 3 begins with the daily offerings. This is the food offering you are to present to the Lord, 2 lambs a year old without defect, as a regular burnt offering each day. 1 lamb was to be offered in the morning and the other at twilight, as verse 4 states. With each lamb came a grain offering, 1/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil from pressed olives. According to verses 5 and 6, the drink offering was 1/4 of a hin of fermented drink with each lamb, poured out to the Lord at the sanctuary, as verse 7 explains. This was the regular burnt offering instituted at Mount Sinai as a pleasing aroma, a food offering presented to the Lord, according to verse 6. On the Sabbath day, the offering doubled. Verse 9 states, "On the Sabbath day, make an offering of 2 lambs a year old without defect, together with its drink offering, and a grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil." This was the burnt offering for every Sabbath, in addition to the regular daily burnt offering and its drink offering. As verse 10 concludes, at the beginning of every month came another layer. Verses 11 through 15 detail the monthly offering: 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old, all without defect. With each bull came a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with oil. With the ram 2/10, and with each lamb 1/10. This was for a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The drink offerings were 1/2 a hin of wine with each bull, 1/3 of a hin with the ram, and 1/4 of a hin with each lamb. 1 male goat was to be presented as a sin offering. These were the monthly burnt offerings throughout the year. Then came the annual festivals. The Passover fell on the 14th day of the first month, as verse 16 records. On the 15th day was the festival, and for 7 days unleavened bread was to be eaten. According to verse 17, verses 19 through 24 prescribe the offerings for each of the 7 days. 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old, all without defect. Along with their grain offerings and drink offerings, 1 male goat was included as a sin offering. These offerings were in addition to the regular morning burnt offering. The Festival of Weeks required similar offerings, as verses 26 and 27 explain. When they presented the first fruits to the Lord during the Festival of Weeks, they were to bring 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old as a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Chapter 29 continues with the 7th month's festivals. On the first day of the 7th month, they were to hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. It was a day for sounding the trumpets, as verse 1 states. The burnt offering consisted of 1 young bull, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old, all without defect, as verse 2 records. These came with their prescribed grain offerings, and 1 male goat as a sin offering, in addition to the monthly and daily offerings. The 10th day of the 7th month was the Day of Atonement. Verse 7 commands, "On the 10th day of this 7th month, hold a sacred assembly. You must deny yourselves and do no work." The offerings for this day are detailed in verses 8 through 11. 1 young bull, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs, all without defect, with their grain offerings. 1 male goat was offered as a sin offering, in addition to the sin offering for atonement and the regular burnt offering. The Festival of Tabernacles began on the 15th day of the 7th month and lasted 7 days. This was the most elaborate series of offerings in the entire year. Verses 12 through 34 detail what was required each day. On the first day, 13 young bulls, 2 rams, and 14 male lambs a year old, all without defect. Each subsequent day, the number of bulls decreased by 1, while the rams and lambs remained constant. On the second day, 12 bulls. On the third day, 11 bulls. This pattern continued until the 7th day, when 7 bulls were offered. On the 8th day, they were to hold a closing special assembly and do no regular work, as verse 35 states. The final offering was 1 bull, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs, all without defect. According to verse 36, verse 39 summarizes, "In addition to what you vow and your free will offerings, offer these to the Lord at your appointed festivals, your burnt offerings, grain offerings, drink offerings, and fellowship offerings." Moses told the Israelites all that the Lord commanded him. As verse 40 concludes, after establishing the mandatory offerings, God addressed voluntary commitments. Chapter 30, verse 1 records Moses saying to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands." The issue was vows, promises people made to God on their own initiative. Verse 2 establishes the basic principle. When a man makes a vow to the Lord, or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said. A man's word was binding. No exceptions, no excuses, but women's vows had different rules. Verse 3 introduces the first situation. When a young woman still living in her father's household makes a vow to the Lord or obligates herself by a pledge, and her father hears about her vow or pledge but says nothing to her, then all her vows and every pledge by which she obligated herself will stand, as verse 4 states. But verse 5 adds, if her father forbids her when he hears about it, none of her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. The Lord will release her because her father has forbidden her. The same principle applied to married women. Verses 6 through 8 explain, if she marries after making a vow, or after her lips utter a rash promise, and her husband hears about it but says nothing, her vows will stand. But if her husband forbids her when he hears about it, he nullifies the vow that obligates her, and the Lord will release her. Verse 9 makes an exception. Any vow or obligation taken by a widow or divorced woman will be binding on her. These women had no male authority over them, so their vows stood without possibility of nullification. For married women, verses 10 through 12 provide more detail. If a woman living with her husband makes a vow, and her husband hears about it, but says nothing and does not forbid her, then all her vows will stand. But if her husband nullifies them when he hears about them, then none of the vows that came from her lips will stand. Her husband has nullified them, and the Lord will release her. The key timing factor appears in verses 14 and 15. If her husband says nothing to her about it from day to day, he confirms all her vows. He confirms them by saying nothing when he hears about them. But if he nullifies them sometime after he hears about them, then he must bear the consequences of her wrongdoing. These were the regulations the Lord gave Moses concerning relationships between a man and his wife, and between a father and his young daughter still living at home. As verse 16 concludes, the Midianites had led Israel into sin at Peor. Now came the reckoning. Chapter 31 verse 1 records the Lord saying to Moses, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for the Israelites. After that, you will be gathered to your people." This would be Moses' final military campaign. So Moses said to the people in verse 3, "Arm some of your men to go to war against the Midianites, so that they may carry out the Lord's vengeance on them." He instructed them to send into battle 1,000 men from each of the tribes of Israel, as verse 4 states. So 12,000 men armed for battle, 1,000 from each tribe, were supplied from the clans of Israel. According to verse 5, Moses sent them into battle along with Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the priest, who took with him articles from the sanctuary and the trumpets for signaling. As verse 6 records, they fought against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses and killed every man, as verse 7 states. Among their victims were Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, with the sword, according to verse 8. The prophet who couldn't curse Israel had ended up counseling the Midianites on how to seduce them. Now he paid the price. The Israelites captured the Midianite women and children and took all the Midianite herds, flocks, and goods as plunder. They burned all the towns where the Midianites had settled, as well as all their camps, as verses 9 and 10 record. They took all the plunder and spoils, including the people and animals, and brought the captives, spoils and plunder, to Moses and Eleazar the priest and the Israelite assembly at their camp on the plains of Moab, by the Jordan across from Jericho, according to verses 11 and 12. Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the community went to meet them outside the camp. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, who returned from the battle, as verse 14 states. He asked them in verse 15, "Have you allowed all the women to live?" He continued in verse 16, "They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people." His command in verse 17 was harsh. "Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man. But save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." This wasn't random cruelty. It was executing judgment on those who had actively participated in leading Israel into sin. Then came purification instructions. Anyone who had killed someone or touched someone who was killed had to stay outside the camp 7 days, as verse 19 states. On the 3rd and 7th days, they had to purify themselves and their captives. They had to purify every garment and everything made of leather, goat hair, or wood. Eleazar the priest said to the soldiers in verse 21, "This is what is required by the law that the Lord gave Moses." He explained in verses 22 and 23 that gold, silver, bronze, iron, tin, lead, and anything else that could withstand fire must be put through the fire to be made clean. But it also had to be purified with the water of cleansing. Whatever couldn't withstand fire had to be put through that water. On the 7th day, they were to wash their clothes and be clean. Then they could come into the camp. The Lord said to Moses in verse 25, "You and Eleazar the priest and the family heads of the community are to count all the people and animals that were captured." The plunder was to be divided equally between the soldiers who took part in the battle and the rest of the community, as verse 27 states. From the soldiers' share, they were to set apart a tribute for the Lord of 1 out of every 500, whether people, cattle, donkeys, or sheep. According to verse 28, from the Israelites' half, they were to select 1 out of every 50 from the people, cattle, donkeys, sheep, and other animals, and give them to the Levites, as verse 30 explains. Moses and Eleazar did as the Lord commanded. The plunder remaining from what the soldiers took totaled 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, and 32,000 women who had never slept with a man, as verses 32 through 35 record. The detailed division of the plunder follows in verses 36 through 47, with precise numbers for each category. Then the officers who were over the units of the army came to Moses and said in verse 49, "Your servants have counted the soldiers under our command, and not one is missing." So they brought an offering to the Lord from what each man had acquired, articles of gold such as armlets, bracelets, signet rings, earrings, and necklaces, to make atonement for themselves before the Lord, as verse 50 states. Moses and Eleazar accepted the gold from them. All the gold from the commanders totaled 16,750 shekels. According to verse 52, Moses and Eleazar brought the gold into the tent of meeting as a memorial for the Israelites before the Lord. As verse 54 concludes, the Reubenites and Gadites, who had very large herds and flocks, saw that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were suitable for livestock, as chapter 32 verse 1 records. So they came to Moses and Eleazar the priest, and to the leaders of the community, and said in verses 2 through 5 that this land would be suitable for their livestock. They requested, "If we have found favor in your eyes, let this land be given to your servants as our possession. Do not make us cross the Jordan." Moses' response in verse 6 was sharp. "Should your fellow Israelites go to war while you sit here?" He reminded them in verses 7 through 13 of what happened when the spies went to explore Canaan. The people's hearts melted in fear. They refused to enter, and God's anger burned against them. That entire generation died in the wilderness because they didn't follow God wholeheartedly. Moses warned in verse 14, "And here you are, a brood of sinners, standing in the place of your fathers and making the Lord even more angry with Israel." If they turned away, God would again leave Israel in the wilderness, and they would be responsible for destroying this entire people. As verse 15 states, then they came closer to Moses and said in verses 16 and 17, "We would like to build pens here for our livestock and cities for our women and children. But we will arm ourselves for battle and go ahead of the Israelites until we have brought them to their place. Meanwhile, our women and children will live in fortified cities for protection from the inhabitants of the land." They promised in verse 18, "We will not return to our homes until each of the Israelites has received their inheritance." They explained in verses 19 and 20 that they wouldn't receive any inheritance with them on the other side of the Jordan, because their inheritance had come to them on the east side. Moses agreed, but with conditions. He said in verses 20 through 22, "If you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before the Lord for battle, and if all of you who are armed cross over the Jordan before the Lord until he has driven his enemies out before him, then when the land is subdued before the Lord, you may return and be free from your obligation to the Lord and to Israel. And this land will be your possession before the Lord." But Moses added a stern warning in verses 23. "But if you fail to do this, you will be sinning against the Lord, and you may be sure that your sin will find you out." He instructed them in verse 24 to build cities for their women and children and pens for their flocks, but to do what they had promised. The Gadites and Reubenites said to Moses in verses 25, "We, your servants, will do as our Lord commands." Their children and wives, their flocks and herds would remain in the cities of Gilead, but all their men armed for battle would cross over to fight before the Lord. As verse 27 states, then Moses gave orders about them to Eleazar, Joshua, and the family heads. He said in verse 29, "If the Gadites and Reubenites cross the Jordan with you, every man armed for battle before the Lord, and the land is subdued before you, then give them the land of Gilead as their possession. But if they didn't cross over armed, they would receive their possession in Canaan." As verse 30 adds, the Gadites and Reubenites answered in verse 31, "Your servants will do what the Lord has said." They would cross over armed into Canaan, but their possession would be on this side of the Jordan. So Moses gave to the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, son of Joseph, the kingdom of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and the kingdom of Og, king of Bashan, as verse 33 states. The text then lists in verses 34 through 42 the cities they rebuilt and renamed in that territory. Chapter 33 opens with a comprehensive review of Israel's journey from Egypt. Verse 1 introduces it. Here are the stages in the journey of the Israelites when they came out of Egypt by divisions under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. At the Lord's command, Moses recorded the stages in their journey, as verse 2 states. They set out from Ramesses on the 15th day of the first month, the day after the Passover. The Israelites went out boldly in full view of all the Egyptians, who were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down. As verses 3 and 4 record, what follows in verses 5 through 49 is a detailed itinerary of every place Israel camped during their 40 years in the wilderness. The list includes over 40 locations, from Sukkoth to the plains of Moab. Each name represented a chapter in their story: places of provision, places of rebellion, places of judgment, places of grace. The journey that should have taken weeks stretched into 4 decades, with each stop marking time as the old generation died and a new one grew. Up the list ends with verse 49. There, on the plains of Moab, they camped along the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth to Abel Shittim. They were finally at the edge of the promised land. Then came instructions for what they would do when they crossed over. The Lord said to Moses on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho in verse 50, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their carved images and their cast idols, and demolish all their high places," as verses 51 and 52 command. They were to take possession of the land and settle in it, for God had given them the land to possess, as verse 53 states. They were to distribute the land by lot, according to their clans. To a larger group, they were to give a larger inheritance, and to a smaller group a smaller one, as verse 54 explains. But verse 55 contains a stern warning. "But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you will live." And verse 56 adds, "Then I will do to you what I planned to do to them." God wasn't vague about what he was giving Israel. Chapter 34 verse 1 records the Lord saying to Moses, "Command the Israelites and say to them, when you enter Canaan, the land that will be allotted to you as an inheritance is to have these boundaries." The southern boundary is described in verses 3 through 5. It would start from the desert of Zin, along the border of Edom, beginning at the southern end of the Dead Sea, cross south of Scorpion Pass, continue to Zin, and go south of Kadesh Barnea. Then it would go to Hazar Adar and over to Asmon, join the Wadi of Egypt, and end at the Mediterranean Sea. The western boundary was simple. As verse 6 states, "Your western boundary will be the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This will be your boundary on the west." For the northern boundary, verses 7 through 9 give the markers: from the Mediterranean Sea to Mount Hor, and from Mount Hor to Lebo Hamath. Then it would go to Zedad, continue to Ziphron, and end at Hazar Enan. The eastern boundary is detailed in verses 10 through 12. It would run from Hazar Enan to Shechem, go down from Shechem to Riblah on the east side of Ain, and continue along the slopes east of the Sea of Galilee. Then it would go down along the Jordan and end at the Dead Sea. Verse 13 records Moses commanding the Israelites, "Assign this land by lot as an inheritance. The Lord has ordered that it be given to the 9.5 tribes, the tribes of Reuben. Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh had already received their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan, as verses 14 and 15 explain. The Lord said to Moses in verse 16 that these were the men to assign the land as an inheritance: Eleazar the priest and Joshua son of Nun. Verses 18 through 29 list one leader from each tribe who would help distribute the land. Each name represented a tribe's future, a family's hope, a promise about to be fulfilled. On the plains of Moab by the Jordan, across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses in chapter 35 verse 1, "Command the Israelites to give the Levites towns to live in from the inheritance the Israelites will possess, and give them pasture lands around the towns," as verse 2 states. The towns would be for them to live in, and the pasture lands would be for their cattle and all their other animals. According to verse 3, the pasture lands around the towns were to extend 1,500 feet from the town wall. Outside the town, they were to measure 3,000 feet on the east, south, west, and north sides, with the town in the center, as verses 4 and 5 explain. They would have this area as pasture land for the towns. 6 of the towns given to the Levites would be cities of refuge, where someone who had killed another person accidentally could flee. In addition to these, they were to give the Levites 42 other towns, as verse 6 states. In all, they were to give the Levites 48 towns, together with their pasture lands, according to verse 7. The towns assigned to the Levites from the Israelites' territory were to be given in proportion to the inheritance of each tribe. As verse 8 explains, "Then the Lord said to Moses in verse 9, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, When you cross the Jordan into Canaan, select some towns to be your cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone accidentally may flee," as verses 10 and 11 state. These cities would be places of protection from the avenger, so that anyone accused of murder wouldn't die before standing trial before the assembly. As verse 12 explains, verses 13 and 14 specify the distribution. 6 towns were to be designated as cities of refuge, 3 on the east side of the Jordan and 3 in Canaan proper. These 6 towns would serve as refuge for Israelites and for foreigners residing among them, so that anyone who had killed another accidentally could flee there. According to verse 15, but not every killing qualified for refuge. Verses 16 through 21 describe intentional murder. If someone struck another with an iron object so that they died, that person was a murderer and must be put to death. The same applied if someone used a stone or wooden object that could kill. If someone hit another with their fist in hostility, or threw something at them intentionally, or in enmity pushed them or struck them with their fist so that they died, that person was a murderer. The avenger of blood was to put the murderer to death upon meeting them, as verse 21 states. By contrast, verses 22 through 25 describe accidental killing. If someone pushed another suddenly without enmity, or threw something at them unintentionally, or dropped a stone on them without seeing them, and they died, but there was no intent to harm, then the assembly was to judge between the accused and the avenger according to these regulations. The assembly was to protect the accused from the avenger and send the accused back to the city of refuge. The accused had to stay there until the death of the high priest, who was anointed with the holy oil, as verse 25 states. But if the accused ever went outside the city of refuge and the avenger found them outside and killed them, the avenger wouldn't be guilty of murder, as verses 26 and 27 explain. The accused had to stay in their city of refuge until the high priest died. Only after that could they return to their own property. According to verse 28, verse 30 establishes the legal standard. Anyone who killed a person was to be put to death as a murderer only on the testimony of witnesses. But no one was to be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. They weren't to accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who deserved to die, as verse 31 states. Nor were they to accept a ransom for anyone who had fled to a city of refuge, allowing them to go back and live on their own land before the high priest died. According to verse 32, the reason appears in verses 33 and 34. Do not pollute the land where you are. Bloodshed pollutes the land, and atonement cannot be made for the land on which blood has been shed, except by the blood of the one who shed it. Do not defile the land where you live and where I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell among the Israelites. The family heads of the clan of Gilead approached Moses with a concern. Chapter 36, verse 1, identifies them as descendants of Machir, son of Manasseh. They spoke before Moses and the leaders in verse 2. When the Lord commanded my Lord to give the land as an inheritance to the Israelites by lot, he ordered you to give the inheritance of our brother Zelophehad to his daughters. This referred back to the earlier case where God ruled that daughters could inherit if there were no sons, but they saw a problem. Verse 3 states their concern. Now, suppose they marry men from other Israelite tribes, then their inheritance will be taken from our ancestral inheritance and added to that of the tribe they marry into. And so part of the inheritance allotted to us will be taken away. Verse 4 adds, when the year of Jubilee for the Israelites comes, their inheritance will be added to that of the tribe into which they marry, and their property will be taken from the tribal inheritance of our ancestors. tribal land could permanently shift to another tribe through marriage. So at the Lord's command, Moses gave this order to the Israelites in verse 5. What the tribe of the descendants of Joseph is saying is right. Verse 6 contains God's solution. This is what the Lord commands for Zelophehad's daughters. They may marry anyone they please as long as they marry within their father's tribal clan. The inheritance of the Israelites wasn't to pass from one tribe to another. For every Israelite was to keep the tribal inheritance of their ancestors. As verse 7 states, verse 8 extends the principle. Every daughter who inherits land in any Israelite tribe must marry someone in her father's tribal clan, so that every Israelite will possess the inheritance of their ancestors. No inheritance could pass from one tribe to another, for each Israelite tribe was to keep the land it inherited. According to verse 9, so Zelophehad's daughters did as the Lord commanded Moses. Verse 11 records, Zelophehad's daughters, Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah, married their cousins on their father's side. They married within the clans of the descendants of Manasseh, son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained in their father's tribe and clan. As verse 12 states, verse 13 concludes the entire book. These are the commands and regulations the Lord gave through Moses to the Israelites on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. 40 years of wandering, 40 years of laws and lessons, 40 years of death and birth, judgment and mercy, rebellion and grace. The old generation was gone. The new generation stood ready. The Jordan River flowed before them. The promised land waited on the other side. If this journey through Numbers opened your eyes to something you've never seen before, don't keep it to yourself. Click that subscribe button so you won't miss the next time we uncover the stories everyone else skips. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their wilderness season has an end date and that God hasn't forgotten his promises. The book of Numbers proves that God finishes what he starts. He brought Israel out of Egypt, and 40 years later, despite everything, he brought them to Canaan's edge. Your story isn't over either. Keep walking. Keep believing. Your Jordan River moment is coming. See you in the next video,